Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples with the People's Collaborative, and welcome to the next episode of Patti's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Jens Grueger. Jens is a pricing and market access expert with the Boston Consulting Group, and he is also on the faculty of the University of Washington Choice Institute. And you may also recognize Jens for his fine work as president of ISPOR in the past several years. Jens, let's get started.
Of course. Thanks very much for the invitation.
I'm delighted to have you here. And we're going to have a robust discussion about HTA legislation and the IRA and a variety of other topics. So I know our listeners are going to really enjoy this conversation. So Jens, you've been advocating for the EU HTA legislation. Can you please summarize what changes that you see occurring in this legislation, particularly as far as how manufacturers will start pursuing HTA and price approval, and how this, if it will, continue, or how this will change their strategy in terms of what to bring to market and when. And let's start to level set with our listeners with a description of the legislation.
Yeah, so the starting point is, and that's what you probably know, is that we have a European Medicines Agency that does the regulatory approval for all of the EU 27 member states. But then we are doing the pricing and reimbursement negotiations for 27 different states. That's part of the European treaty that healthcare is a member state responsibility. These processes typically start with an assessment of the comparative effectiveness of the drug, an added benefit assessment, and then they go into the price negotiations. And in a way, having 27 reviews of the very same evidence is a huge waste. It's duplication and triplication for that. And that's probably one of the reasons why the average time from marketing authorization to actual availability to patients in Europe is 517 days. That's 1.5 years. So, I mean, that is totally unacceptable. And so what we are now going to see from January 2025 is that this first step, the clinical assessment from a comparative effectiveness perspective, that will be centralized initially for oncology drugs and for ATMPs, advanced therapy medicinal products, so like cell and gene therapies. They would go through what is then called the joint clinical assessment. And I have three expectations from this. The first thing is it will be much faster. So basically, this will be more aligned with the regulatory process. So actually, the assessment will already start at the end of the regulatory process. And the expectation, the kind of the guidance is that the joint clinical assessment should be available 6 weeks after the marketing authorization. So that would shave off a lot of time. So that has the potential to make sure that drugs reach patients faster. The second point is that when you have 27 different groups of people looking at data, somehow they come to different conclusions from that. And that is confusing everybody. That is confusing the patient. That is confusing the medical profession in there. So I hope that there will be a higher degree of clarity of what is actually the data that comes out of this. And the third thing is, and that is related to the fact that the portfolio of the industry is changing. We're having much more complex technologies. We're speaking about cell and gene therapies. We will have mRNA therapies coming. So because the resources are so diluted in each of the countries, there are many countries that simply don't have the time to understand these technologies, and that certain evidence that was produced in the past for primary care medicine cannot be available. How do you do a kind of double-blinded clinical trial for a cell and gene therapy that doesn't work? Or how do you kind of look at the endpoints that are appropriate when you do an early stage cancer therapy? You're not getting overall survival in any time soon. So I think from that perspective, the quality of the reviews will be improved. So we are going to see how that starts. It's less than 10 months away from that. And we start initially, as I said, with oncology and advanced therapy medicinal products. Then from 2028, orphan drugs will be added from 2030. It will be for all medicines and for select medical devices that go through this the way centralized procedure.
So you noted 517 days from the date of the decision to availability to patients. Is there an internal goal that's been set of what would be a good amount of time that would be acceptable?
We have something that's called the Transparency Directive, which has been in place for many years, and that says it should be 180 days maximum for the review and 180 days maximum for the negotiation. That is something which, for example, we have in Germany. That is always exactly those timelines. At the time when you introduce the product in Germany, there is the opportunity to immediately make that product available, and it's actually reimbursed for that. But then you have to submit your value dossier, and then there is a process for 6 months to then come to the added benefit rating, and then there is a 6-month negotiation around that. And so that will probably be something that across Europe we want to achieve. There is also the European pharmaceutical legislation, and they have expressed the goal that companies should seek to make their products available across all 27 member states within 2 years from marketing authorization. Now, very quickly, then there was an analysis done that this has never happened in the past. There is no single example where a drug that was approved in Europe was then available across 27 member states within 2 years. The problem is often that, of course, it is a single market. There is a lot of price referencing parallel trade that companies are concerned about. Within Europe, not everybody has the same economic ability. When you go from Germany or Denmark down to Portugal, you're already having a 30-40% lower GDP per capita. When you go to Romania, Bulgaria, it's even lower. So somehow through this European market, there is price convergence, and it is more and more difficult than to make these products available in countries that cannot afford to pay these high prices. So that's the other piece that we still need to take care of. But I think it's a great step forward that we have this joint clinical assessment.
So thinking about one of the critical stakeholders are manufacturers, of course, and I would assume that terms like price convergence is something that would create some level of concern. What kind of concerns are manufacturers expressing with respect to the EU HTA legislation?
The biggest concern at the moment is that we're 10 months before day one, and we don't know how it's going to work. This is quite embarrassing. The initiative was started basically in 2006. That's when the first HTA agencies got together on a voluntary basis. That's when what was called the UNETA initiative was launched, the European Network of HTA. So we are now 18 years later, and we still haven't figured out how exactly that works. The European Commission had published a tight timeline when they wrote this thing into law in 2022. But I think on every single work package, they are now 3 or 6 months behind. So industry is very concerned about that. And they're particularly concerned about one element. The whole legislation is using what they call the PICO framework. So somehow you have to define what is your reference case. And the reference case is characterized by what are the patients for which I'm evaluating this technology, what exactly is the intervention, what's the comparators, the standard of care that is going to be considered, and what are the outcomes and the timelines to observe the outcomes. So that's the PICO, the PICO that is behind that. And industry would say, well, I mean, we can recognize that for a broader indication, there are different subgroups of patients that we have to look at. There may be more severe patients, less severe patients, older patients, younger patients in there. So it may be that we define 2 or 3 patient groups for that. It may be that we say there is 1 or 2 comparators that are appropriate. So perhaps give me 3 or 4 PICOs, and then I can design my submission. It looks like we may have 27 PICOs, that every country says, oh, we are so different, and we have such a different kind of medical practice in here. We want different things. And then you are not actually getting to the kind of efficiency that you want with the whole legislation. You will then say, oh, it's 27 plus 1. I have to address the 27 member states. And on top of that, I now have a European. And that is not really what industry was expecting for that. I think this is a very kind of tangible risk in the beginning. I think that is something which 30 years ago, when the European harmonization on the regulatory processes came, people had the same concerns at that time. So I'm revealing my age, that I was involved at that time already. Nowadays, people would say the European Medicines Agency and the approval processes, that's the best thing we could ever imagine. It's predictable, it's robust process, it's not as fast as the FDA, but it is reasonably kind of fast how it works. So hopefully it will not take us 30 years, that we then also look back and say this European joint clinical assessment is the best thing. I hope that over the next 4 or 5 years, we will kind of iron out the kinks in this process. And then we can say it's actually helping us to accelerate time to patients for these important medicines.
So the current legislation is suggesting one base case scenario, correct?
It doesn't say that there should be one base case. There will be a specification. The kind of agencies will submit what they see the relative PICOs for that, and that will be then harmonized. So there will probably be more than one, but hopefully it is less than a handful that we have as the core PICOs. I think that's what everybody is wondering. Kind of when will we find out? Because then once this has been agreed, the process is very tight, and then you have to be very fast in then providing the data. And the amount of data that has to be submitted for some of the national procedures, I mean, is huge. Thousands of pages, not as much as what we have for regulatory approval, but much more what companies were able to submit to CMS for their price negotiations. So it will be a significant kind of new process for manufacturers, and many manufacturers have a lot of capabilities and capacities at the country level to produce the country submissions. This is a new process at a European level, so companies will have to figure out how they best kind of operate this new model.
So you spend your days advising manufacturers and other stakeholders. What are you advising manufacturers to do right now to be fully prepared for this impending legislation?
So the thing that you always say at that point is engage with the relevant stakeholders. Be close, kind of understand how that works. That helps you prepare for this. That's a little bit of a problem because, of course, there are many companies that now want to engage. So again, I mean, we don't have the capacity for that, but there are certain forums where the European Commission is allowing people to come together. There are initiatives that are industry-sponsored, syndicated, where they're bringing this. So I think that's the first thing. The second piece is, I mean, you just have to build the European dossier. The template actually is available for that. If you have a product where you're not completely sure, is it going to be authorized in November 2024, or might that be delayed by 6 or 8 weeks and go into 2025? You should already be at the point where you have started that procedure. But of course, I mean, it is not very clear what you have to do. And so, I mean, that is something where also the European Federation, FPA, is criticizing the lack of that. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a little bit of a delay in the actual implementation, but it will come over the next years.
One last question on this. How will the member states' needs be prioritized? I mean, is it going to be based on number of patients, their GDP? What's going to be the process for doing that?
I mean, you have two countries that are population and kind of in importance dominating the European Union, which is Germany and France. And the Germans initially were a little lukewarm with this whole process. They said, we have a very nice process in Germany and we don't need that. But when it then became clear that we are going to have a European process, the Germans jumped on board. And so they're driving that in many ways. So I expect that ultimately people will say, well, I mean, Germany and France are giving you the kind of direction for where you should go. In principle, of course, every member state has the same votes or the kind of same roles in there. So it could also be that some of the smaller member states are very interested in that. The actual joint clinical assessment will be done by a select group. It's like the rapporteur system that we have at the regulatory level. So I would imagine that a country like Germany and France, they would have more resources to staff these review groups. It would probably be like on the regulatory side that certain countries, certain authorities, they will specialize. Some of them will say, well, we are the ones that have a lot of understanding of immune-mediated diseases, or I am a group that understands cancer or hematology very well. So we will see, I would expect that there will be some specialization how that works. And so then that when I have a product in a specific direction, there is a higher likelihood that it will be the Germans or the Swedes or the French that are reviewing that. But that's very similar to what we have at the moment with the regulatory side. So that's not, I think companies understand how that works.
Let's jump across the pond from you. The US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, was signed into law in 2022, authorizing the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, to negotiate prices directly with manufacturers for selected drugs that were high expenditure items or single sourced.
Yeah.
What, if any, are the cross-border implications of the EU HTA legislation with the US IRA?
First, I mean, there are not really any kind of relationships with that. It happens to kind of be at a similar time. So we see the implementation of the European legislation 25. We'll see the impact of the first round of CMS negotiation 26. Of course, it's happening already. But of course, I mean, companies will now have slightly different parameters under which they are making their investment decisions. I mean, I guess the audience knows that by now extremely well that there is a difference whether you have a small molecule or a large molecule, a biologic molecule. There is 4 years more that you have as a commercial lifespan within Medicare when you have a biologic molecule. So when you're now thinking about an investment case that you're making as a manufacturer on the US side, the kind of NPV, the net present value of a biologic molecule might be longer than it is for a small molecule. And this assessment may be very different in Europe. In Europe, in many countries, we still have infusion constraints for this. Many of the infused medicines of the and even of the subcutaneous injections for that will be hospital products for that. So from a European perspective, you are actually interested in getting small molecules because there's much faster uptake for them. Of course, I mean, in the US, I would still say that the uptake of when you have a pill, it's always a benefit for the patient. But I mean, now many of these therapies, they require monthly injections, even 6 monthly injections, or they may be curative therapies. That is something which is not, I mean, it does have such a disadvantage over an oral medicine. But the perspective on biologics versus oral between the US and Europe will be different in the future. Similarly, you could say because of IRA, a company might say, when we launch the product, we want to launch it immediately with a relatively sizable indication, because by initial launch sets the clock ticking. And so what I often had at the moment that I was starting with last line cancer therapy, and then over the years I was working my way back to the earlier lines, I would sometimes find that it takes me longer than the 9 or 13 years that I have on the market to get to my early lines of therapies if I follow the traditional approach for that. So can I immediately jump to second or third line in the kind of sequence for that? Makes perfect sense from the US. Is a little bit more difficult from a ex-US, from a European perspective. You typically want to launch in a high unmet need, last line therapy. The evidence bar is lower for that. Because of the high unmet need, the price anchor that you can achieve is higher and different from the US, where you can still increase prices. In Europe, you cannot increase the price. Whatever you have as the starting price, it can only go down from there. So if you don't have the high price of that last line indication up front, it affects your future in that. So I think in companies, there will be differences in how they are looking at the business cases between the US and Europe. It's not that companies will say, we will now ignore Europe, or that they say, we only want biologics. I mean, if you have a wonderful pill that deals with your weight loss, I mean, that, of course, is a drug that you definitely want to have in your portfolio. But on an asset-by-asset basis, the business cases for the investment into the late-stage development, they will look different, and they will kind of look different by indication. They will look different by population that I'm targeting, whether it's a younger population or an older population that I'm targeting, and whether it's small or large molecules. So I think there will be changes in the portfolio that we will see over time.
If you were to advise manufacturers operationally what they should be doing with respect to this, what would you suggest?
I think the first question is, we still know very little about how maximum fair prices will be set in IRA. And there's been some speculation, does CMS have a value framework? CMS has very clear guidance from the legislator on the data that has to be submitted from the manufacturers. There is a lot of kind of administrative data or cost data about the cost of development, the cost of production, the investment into public sources into this. But there's also then the concept of the alternative therapy and the submission of evidence for that. And I tend to believe that evidence will play an important role in how the maximum fair prices will be set. And so I think for the manufacturers, the most important thing is to review their evidence base and fill any gaps that may exist there. This is the main difference in the US versus Europe. In Europe, we are still reviewing the products at the initial launch. And there are loads of gaps in your evidence base for that. And so we have a lot of conditional situations covered with evidence development. But if you've been on the market for 9 or 13 years, or 7 and 11 years, when you're being then called up for this, there will be less tolerance for uncertainty because you've had you've enjoyed wonderful sales. That's why you are now negotiated. You're one of the most successful molecules in that, and so the expectation is that you have invested into evidence generation. So having studies that address different populations, not just the population that you had at launch, but that you're also going into pregnant women, into vulnerable populations, the whole question around equity that you want to address more broadly for this real-world evidence about how some of these characteristics of the drug translate into benefits when they are used in clinical practice. I think all of these things will matter a lot. It's not that you want to then dump 5,000 pages of publications on CMS. You have restrictions on the size of your submission, but to have kind of compelling evidence and complete evidence for your molecule, that is something which you want to focus on.
So let's keep digging down just a little bit. So the first 10 drugs were identified last fall with the US IRA. And what do you think is going to be revealed, if you were to put your fortune teller hat on, about this US IRA in terms of how it's going to affect the Medicare budget? And how do you think it's going to affect the next round of drugs identified?
So, I mean, one of the interesting design elements of the whole legislation is that it looks at gross Medicare expenditure. And so drugs like Eliquis, that is on the top of that, I don't remember exactly. I think it was like 14 billion in gross Medicare expenditure for that. When you look at what is the global sales that BMS has on Eliquis, it is just a notch above the 14 billion. So this 14 billion is a kind of is just a number. This is not reflecting the actual revenues, because there are significant discounts. And the majority of the products that have been selected based on the gross Medicare expenditures are primary care products where this contracting is in place, and where I think there will be some disappointment on behalf of CMS and the legislator that the expected savings will not be realized. They will realize that, oh, these products are already very significantly discounted, and I mean, there are these kind of limits for the maximum fair price depending on how long the products will be on the market. They will find that these products are already way below those kinds of upper limits for that. So I don't know whether that was behind the comment that Pascal Soriot from AstraZeneca made, that the initial price proposal from CMS wasn't as bad as he had feared. I mean, that was exactly the word that he used, but it was going in that direction. I'm paraphrasing him. It wasn't clear to everybody how much these products were discounted. Now, of course, in the next round of products, we are going to have more specialty products. There will be more cancer drugs. And people had expected Ibrance and another drug already on the top 10 drugs. They didn't make it this year. The cancer drugs are probably not that much contracted, and so there is more opportunity to save. So over time, it will be a more balanced portfolio of kind of broader primary care drug and specialty drugs that will be there. So then there will be some savings realized. But on this first one, I think people will just say, wow, I mean, there's a lot of effort for very little financial gain that we have.
Did Medicare state an expected savings from this legislation?
I think the Congressional Budget Office made those calculations for that. And I don't think that they made it on an annual basis. I've only seen kind of the 10-year projections. There was trillions of dollars that were expected to be saved as a consequence of that. So we will see kind of how much of that is actually realized.
So one more question. You alluded to this with Medicare and the value framework. Talk a little bit more about what that is in your opinion, and how can it be used by manufacturers in their development process?
I think that's the billion-dollar question at the moment, because at the moment, I mean, we can only speculate. We can only say that the majority of data points that were requested are more kind of financial data points in terms of the cost of production and investments that have been made for that. And then there is the seventh or so element, which says, and submit data on the clinical benefit. So far, what we have seen is that CMS exactly follows the letters of the law, and that's how they selected the drug. There was no deviation from this. The law doesn't say how they should now be using those different parameters for that. There have been some speculations for that. Of course, I mean, I said it, the concept of the alternative therapies is something that CMS was describing, and then saying that they also want to collect the data for this alternative therapy. So there will be an element of comparative effectiveness. I assume that will be looked at. But I mean, many of these medicines have more than one use. And so how do you look at that? Do you look at the major use of this product within the Medicare population and then have the comparative effectiveness for this? If you have a product that has different doses, different formulations, different indications, how do you bring these things together? I think that's something which we haven't seen much. Of course, we can say outside of the US, people are used to that. The Germans, the French, the English, they are doing that all the time. They would say, well, I mean, we just work based on the different population groups that we have in there, and then we get a maximum fair price in the different population groups, and then we do some kind of weighted average across that. Does CMS have enough data to kind of establish how much the products were used across the different populations? How much of a difference does it make? These are the kinds of things that we will see. The interesting element is that we have a number of products in the same class. We have a number of products in the same indication. So in some ways, you almost have like a Latin square design from a statistical perspective, where you can say, well, under certain assumptions, I can look at how did they treat the different diabetes drug, how did they treat the different anticoagulation drugs in this roster, and does that tell us something? Which drug got a better maximum fair price that is that correlated with what we know the evidence is that exists for these products. So I'm sure that will spur a lot of interesting research and speculation, because we still have to say we only have 10 data points, 10 drugs for that. So yeah, I'm rambling a little bit here. I think ultimately it will be important for CMS to be specific about their value framework. I think that was always something, whatever you think of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, but they have spent a lot of time in establishing a value framework. That's the same thing that they find in Europe, that all of the agencies have their value frameworks, their methods, guidelines, and other kinds of things. So over time, I expect something that can also be to be the case in the US, and then it will make it much more kind of clear to manufacturers what they have to focus on.
So let's switch gears a little bit to a topic that you really can't read any kind of news within our field without coming upon integrated evidence plans, or IEPs. Tell us what that is, and it sounds obvious, logical, and relevant, but why is this not already in place? What's different about the way we already integrate evidence without a particular plan?
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
I mean, the starting point is that we have to recognize what is the medicine that we bring to market. The medicine comes in the form of a tablet or an infusion, but in the end, it's a piece of knowledge that we're making available, knowledge kind of how to treat a certain disease, and that is then pressed into this tablet for this. So the evidence that we are generating during the development for the medicine, but also when that medicine is then on the market, this evidence base, I mean, that basically constitutes the molecule or the medicine that we have there. Now, the evidence that is expected differs by the different stakeholders in the system, and we have the regulators. They look at efficacy, quality, and safety, and in some ways they are at the beginning of this chain. In there, if you don't get the marketing authorization, the license from the regulator, you don't have a medicine. You just have a molecule, but it's not. It cannot be prescribed. So in many ways, people are looking at the regulatory evidence requirements as the priority in that. But then you realize, in particular in Europe, but increasingly also in the US, that once the license has been given, somebody then has to cover the product and has to put up the money for this. And so payers, and often supported by health technology assessment agencies, they are looking at comparative effectiveness and budget impact and economic impact that it has on the broader society for that. That's very different data than what we have been submitting to the regulators. And so that's the second piece of the evidence. And then the product is actually reimbursed and is available for healthcare providers and for patients. They have additional questions for that. The healthcare provider will want to understand, well, where does that drug fit into my therapeutic armamentarium? What's kind of the place of that therapy in the treatment guidance? The patient will want to understand, so what is the worst thing that can happen to me? What I read all these different side effects. Am I going to have that? Patients are typically very risk averse. Once they've read the package insert, they say, well, I'd rather not take that medicine, reading all of these things. Or you may have patients that say, I'm in a desperate situation. I know that I have this cancer. This cancer is going to kill me. I've not responded to 2 lines of therapy. There is a new therapy out there, and this therapy at least gives me a 10% chance that I will survive. And so I'm willing to kind of look at these things. So all of that data somehow has to be made available. And in the past, how companies have worked on that is in a sequential way. Say, okay, the regulators are developing their piece, and then the people that deal with HTA and payers, they would say, okay, where are the gaps? Can I add to this thing? And then medical affairs came in and said, okay, but for our prescribers, I still have additional questions. That is not creating the optimal program. I mean, certain parameters may have been set on the regulatory side, but the regulators may have said, I'm actually quite flexible in what exactly you use as the comparator for how exactly you design. I have certain clear expectations, but if it turns out that the payers would rather see that drug as the comparator, or that from a patient perspective, this endpoint is a very important one. Of course, include that in your clinical trial design. So integrated evidence planning for me means that we're not doing it sequentially. We're doing it really kind of jointly. We start very early on to have a conversation between all the different functions. What are we actually expecting that this drug can do? Now, that is at a very early stage. We are talking about late stage research, maybe around first in human. So we have very limited data. But I mean, typically companies have a good understanding of the molecule, of the disease, of the pathophysiology. So at that time, you can have these conversations. That's going to completely rewrite textbooks because it's such a kind of step change in how we're treating patients, or is it an improvement of the other therapies that we have? But having that conversation early on then gives you some ideas. Is it really about optimizing the evidence because I have to have everything, I'm establishing this new class, or is it something where I would just say, I was just want to be in the market. This is an important area in there. Everybody else has their GLP-1 and wants to play in the obesity space. I also want to come in, so I don't have to be better. I just have to be there. And so that changes how you look at your development plans. And so that would have very different parameters in terms of how you look at speed, how you look at breadth, and how you look at risk for your development plans. These are the parameters that ultimately the investment committees in the pharmaceutical company would look at. And so you have these things jointly agreed between regulatory, access, medical, patients. That just means that you have a more efficient evidence production. It's more compelling for different stakeholders and will result in more patients being able to benefit from these medicines.
If you were in charge of a pharmaceutical company, how would you design the clinical, preclinical, regulatory, med affairs, commercialization teams?
I mean, that's a very good question. And I've never been at that point. I've been at the senior vice president level, so I saw many things, but more in my area. I mean, it is very clear that ultimately you need to have interesting molecules. I mean, you can think about your customers and all these kinds of things, but if you don't have a pipeline, if you don't have the molecules, so it is important that you have a extremely strong research capability. And I mean, that's what we also see. 50% of the molecules that the companies are bringing to market are insourced from other companies, from small biotechs that are coming up. So you also need a very strong licensing and business development group that understands these things at the early stages. So I think in all the companies I've worked, I was at Novartis, Pfizer, Roche in my last 20 years in the industry. There was a lot of emphasis on having the best research groups for this. What you then need to organize is how do you manage the interaction between early and late stage development for that. And I think that is something where companies look very different. Is that you throw the molecule over the fence, there have been some research people, and then when you have the first indication, it goes to the late stage development. How do you make that work well? I think that is something where what you now see is the really successful companies, they are successful because they have one of these mega blockbusters. Whether it's Humira or Keytruda or Dupixent, these are the kinds of drugs that are making 15, 20, 25 billion. And these are companies that very early on realized that we can develop these molecules in many different patient populations, many different indications. And that's something which is still difficult for many companies. How do you make sure that when this molecule, for example, immuno-oncology, these drugs originally came from immune-mediated diseases. Then companies threw them over the fence to oncology, and then they remained in oncology. I'm pretty sure that had we earlier started to look at these things, how they work in rheumatoid arthritis and other areas, we would have seen even more things. But Keytruda, Humira, Dupixent, these are the drugs that have very broad set of indications. That's something which I think in the future will be key for companies to understand those potentials. And that's where you see companies are using Gen AI, artificial intelligence very early on to understand all of the different opportunities that exist for these molecules.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you need excellent, I mean, that's when you're in late stage development, everything shifts towards how do you prepare for this market? And that's, of course, where you want to engage early with your different stakeholders for that. You want to really listen to what their needs are, what evidence has to be produced. That's when the integrated evidence comes in. That's when you have to think about how you prioritize your different indications, how you prioritize your geographies. I mean, yes, the US will always come first, second and third probably, but then I think I still have this romantic view that ultimately we also want to bring these medicines to Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America, to all places in the world. That is really the remit of a global organization. So, I mean, that's when you then have to have the capabilities to launch these products successfully, to then get the uptake and to get these medicines to as many people as possible that need this medicine. So that was a long thing, and I don't know whether it was very differentiated. It's not that this. I think all of the companies I worked in, they try to do these things. Companies that made different choices. You can't do everything. You don't have infinite resources for that. But I think what I'm seeing particularly is that companies are saying, how can we make sure that we have a chance to get the next Keytruda or Humira or Dupixent, because that ultimately is the key to success.
So one last question on this. I'm curious, when you alluded a couple of questions ago to that companies would reassess how they evaluate risk, and that there was the opportunity perhaps that they may choose just to be on the market to have a slice of the pie. That harkens back to, the 80s and 90s, where you'd have 15 ACE inhibitors. Do you think there's a chance that we'll have a little more of this, or will we continue down this road that people are seeking this singular blockbuster and not really worried about being fourth or fifth in the market?
It's less than what we had in the past. And I think that is the beauty now, that we have a much deeper pipeline today. But you still see companies that are thinking about, do I also need my immuno-oncology drug? If it's not a PD-1, PD-L1, what are the other immune pathways that I can work for? You see this whole frenzy that everybody wants to have a GLP-1 incretin product now, because that is the kind of new hype in that. So there is still an element. It's not as bad as it was in the 20 years ago, when some people said, industry pipelines are really kind of thin, and then we're not having anything new. So it will be a kind of mix in there. As every kind of good portfolio planning, you want to play in the different areas for that. You need certain things that are in a more predictable area, where you are not the first one. You want to be better. You want to kind of optimize on the experience that you have seen from the number one, two, three drug in the market. You also want to have a certain place where you're really unique, and you are, as I said, rewriting textbooks, bringing the first drug in a specific modality to market. Still, of course, it's only a few companies that can do that consistently, and that have been successful over many years. There are many companies now that when I go out and say, look, I mean, the pendulum that was very much with the payers when everything was kind of a me too, me three, me five product, that has swung over to industry because we have such amazing modalities now. But that is not true for every company. So I also have some frustrated people sometimes sitting and saying, well, unfortunately, we don't have a gene therapy in the pipeline. We're not in the mRNA space. GLP-1 passed. Not everybody has that luxury.
I know that you do a bit of work in the health equity arena. Does health equity fit into the HTA decision-making process? And if so, what are some of those low-hanging fruits?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, health equity is clearly something that we have somewhat neglected in the past. We looked at companies, that homogeneous entities. We were focusing on getting national approval, national reimbursement. In the US, we're focusing on the national payers for that. It was more from the access perspective that people said, can we also then broaden our geographic footprint? What does it take for us to get into China, Brazil, India? Can we make these products available in Latin America, increasingly in Africa? We've had a number of companies that have then said that we cannot neglect Africa. We also need to make sure that our medicines are benefiting people there. But then I think during the pandemic, it became clear to everybody, particularly during the pandemic, probably also before that, that even within the highly developed countries, we still have very differential access to diagnostics and treatment in the COVID space. And we know that Black African Americans, they have a higher rate of certain cardiovascular conditions, and they're less treated for these conditions. I mean, we've done some research. We said probably it is just that the access to kind of treatment is different, and that's why you kind of experience more of the complications. But once you have the complications, it should be the same, because everybody then knows, I mean, that you have this propensity for this disease, so we want to develop the subsequent things. But it is not the case. I mean, Black African Americans then continue to have less access to specialists and to certain medicines in the US, whether it's England, whether it's in Europe. So I think that's something where people have started to see health equity as kind of much more pressing issue in there. I think companies are still struggling to look at that. Is it a business, or is it just the right thing to do? Of course, ideally, it should be the right thing to do and a business for that. And I've always come to it from the perspective that you can say these are populations where I haven't optimized my commercial opportunity. So it is a commercial opportunity to do health equity and kind of consider that. But there are many things related to that. When you then commit to this, you really have to consider this early in product development. You have to think about, do we develop medicines that are also suitable for different populations? Do I represent these populations in my clinical development programs? Most companies now have this sensitivity, and they have clear guidance that depending on the disease, depending on the mix of different populations, the prevalence in different populations, they're also representing that in their clinical development programs. But then I come to market and I have my marketing campaigns. Do I also consider the needs of different populations? That it starts with simple things like, do I have the right language for this, both in terms of the word that I'm using and the actual language that I'm using for it? Do I have the right channels to reach these? Do I provide the right tools for the providers that they can actually then see this? And then kind of we see these things. I mean, the example that people often say that some of the diagnostic tools that are now kind of using light-based approaches to measure your blood pressure and other things, they work differently on white skin than on dark skin. And so there are things where we say, well, I mean, it may be more difficult, but we have to find ways that it also works on dark skin, because we want to provide everybody with the opportunity to benefit from that diagnostic. So I think it's something which is much more prominent now for companies. We did some research both with pharma and with medical device companies. They're all having certain programs in place to address this. It is kind of, health equity is not that any single stakeholder can change these things. Health equity is something that starts in schools, that starts how we educate our children, how we feed our children, how we provide values to our children, and then go broadly for that. So that is not within the scope of what the pharma company can do, but the pharma company can certainly help. In particular, diagnostic companies, I think they have a large opportunity at the early stages to understand the differential risk between different populations and make sure that we are consistent. So we have certain ideas how that can work. We'll see much more over time, but it will ultimately depend on kind of what are the incentives that this will be brought in. We have the investment, the investors that are increasingly looking at the aspect of health equity, at corporate social governance, sustainability, and these aspects for that. but it also has to be an intrinsic business value that companies can actually be rewarded financially for the efforts that they're making for this.
So you were a past president of ISPOR, and ISPOR now has a new CEO and is making some really interesting and progressive changes, it seems. Can you reflect a little bit about your tenure there and what you see the organization is heading towards?
Yeah, I've been a member of ISPOR for over 20 years. I was not one of the founding members. It was still APOR when it was started, but I think from 1999 it was ISPOR. That's when I joined.
I was a founding student member.
Fantastic. I had colleagues that were founding members, so I've always heard about them, and I've been very impressed, both in terms of the kind of quality, but also the quality of the work that ISPOR has been doing over the years. It has initially been a little pharma heavy, so many of the people that started it came from a pharma and an academic background, but I think the membership is now quite diverse. Roughly kind of 30% pharma, 30% consulting, 30% academia, 10% government and NGOs. That's probably still the area that is a little underrepresented for this. The meetings are getting bigger. I liked it when the meetings were only 500 or 800 people, and then after 3 days, you had the impression you had spoken to everybody at the meeting. Now it's 5,000, 6,000, probably future 10,000 people that are coming together. Not as big as ASCO or American Diabetes Association, but it's a very big meeting now, where and that is good because so many people come together. I was the president in 2020-21, so that was in the middle when the pandemic started. So this was a very different presidency. I didn't kind of preside over large meetings in there. I had to work with then CEO Nancy Berg to see how do we change our digital engagement strategy for that, because suddenly everything had to be remote. Our conferences were remote. I thought it was a great opportunity to expand the reach of ISPOR, because we're still seeing that most of the people that are coming to the meetings, they are from North America and Western Europe. But we want to reach people all over the world. We think that there is a huge need for people in India, in Southeast Asia, in Africa to participate. Unfortunately, it was that even with the digital offerings, it were the same kind of people that were coming. We didn't expand much. I think that's still something which is on the agenda going forward. Mm-hmm. Rob Abbott, now as the new CEO and executive director, he comes in at a time when we are getting out of the pandemic. It is a new normal that we are having. He wants to lead ISPOR through the next growth phase. I think ISPOR has not just survived the pandemic. We've come out in a kind of good position from our membership, and I mean, at the conference in Atlanta, in the business meeting, there will also be insights into the financial situation. The financial situation for ISPOR is sound and then solid, and in that sense, we were lucky how we could get through the pandemic. This is a great opportunity now to expand further. We've been very technology focused at ISPOR, so it was about cost effectiveness for drugs and devices. I think increasingly aspects of what's our offering for health systems, what's our offering for different geographies. These are the kinds of areas where ISPOR is expanding, where it has a very strong strategy for that. So I'm a proud member of ISPOR. I'm looking forward to Atlanta and Barcelona, the two big conferences that we have this year. I think from next year, it's also going to go back into other geographies, because there are people in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, that are also hoping that ISPOR is coming closer to them again. So, I mean, that is going to be the next growth area for ISPOR.
Yes, I'm very excited for the future with Rob Abbott coming in. So thank you for that historical perspective. I'm going to throw a couple of rapid fire questions at you. What is one thing that our field has gotten right?
I think we have a strong scientific foundation. Sometimes people are a little annoyed when we speak about cost effectiveness and opportunity costs, but it is the right thing to also not just look at kind of what it means for those that benefit, but also for those that where we have to take the resource. So I think we have a very solid, deep foundation as a science, as a kind of group.
What have we gotten wrong?
I think we still have the patient as the last thing that we are thinking about. It has improved. It is something kind of people would say, oh, did we consider the patient? But when it comes to patient-centered outcomes, patient-centered research, patient-centered healthcare, that's something where we can go. I think that's we're having a task force at ISPOR on value-based healthcare. That's something which we can learn from value-based healthcare, how you put patients at the center of the design of your process of care. I think that's something which also in our field, from an industry perspective, from a health economics perspective, we have to do more.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, that seems like the answer to what my next question was going to be, which is what have we ignored? So let me re-ask, have we gotten anything wrong where we have proceeded down a pathway that just was ill explored, was methodologically subpar, anything that because we are a learning health system, right?
Yeah.
What have we done that we really have learned from and are doing better now?
So I may regret my answer, but I would say until about 4 or 5 years ago, our focus on the quality, that was a dead end in there. I think, I mean, it's clear that some people say that ultimately we want to have one number, one yardstick that we can apply. People have given kind of many reasons for that. And of course, but we have to find ways that we are looking at all of the different aspects for them, not kind of reduce it to one number. I'm very excited about the whole concept of the GRACE, the generalized risk-adjusted cost effectiveness that Darius, Dr. Waller, and Chuck Phelps have developed. This has really been a major methodological breakthrough that brings in things like how do we think about disease severity in the assessment, how do we think about different risk perceptions that people have when they're using these technologies. So I think today we can say we have more than just the quality. And I mean, coming back to our discussions around IRA in the US, there is a very clear prohibition to use the quality in these assessments. We've written a number of papers, and I think they've also been read by CMS, that there are alternatives to the quality. And if we don't like the quality because we think it has some ethical concerns in kind of emphasizing or kind of disadvantaging disabled people and older people, there are quite a number of alternatives to the quality that we can now use and that we can then introduce through the GRACE framework and do better.
If someone wanted to learn more about the GRACE framework, where would you recommend they go?
I think Dr. Waller and Phelps, they've written quite a number of kind of easier pieces around that, and so you don't have to read all the kind of math and economics around that. So I've seen some very good ones.
Always really excellent work from him. Well, Jens, this has been really educational, as I anticipated that it might be, and also just incredibly enjoyable. I want to thank you for your breadth of knowledge that you have so eloquently shared with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.